breaking off to sanitize him, as well as his aircraft. But he had apparently smuggled the papers aboard the plane, for he knew that to be captured as an anonymous, stateless civilian meant having virtually no legal rights and running the risk of being shot as a spy in accordance with custom. A captured U.S. military man, however, becomes a commodity of value for his captors while he remains alive. The Indonesian government derived immediate material concessions from the United States as a result of the incident. Whether the Indonesians thereby agreed to keep silent about Pope is not known, but on May 27th the pilot and his documents were presented to the world at a news conference, thus contradicting several recent statements by high American officials. Notable amongst these was President Eisenhower's declaration on April 30th concerning Indonesia. Our policy is one of careful neutrality and proper deportment all the way through so as not to be taking sides where it is none of our business. And on May 9th, an editorial in the New York Times had stated, "It is unfortunate that high officials of the Indonesian government have given further circulation to the false report that the United States government was sanctioning aid to Indonesia's rebels. The position of the United States government has been made plain again and again. Our Secretary of State was emphatic in his declaration that this country would not deviate from a correct neutrality. The United States is not ready to step in to help overthrow a constituted government. Those are the hard facts. Jakarta does not help its case here by ignoring them. With the exposure of Pope and the lack of rebel success in the field, the CIA decided that the light was no longer worth the candle and began to curtail its support. By the end of June, Indonesian army troops loyal to Sukarno had effectively crushed the dissident military revolt. The Indonesian leader continued his adroit balancing act between the communists and the army until 1965, when the latter, likely with the help of the CIA, finally overthrew his regime. 15. Western Europe 1950s and 1960s. Fronts within fronts within fronts. At the British Labour Party conference in 1960, Michael Foot, the party's future leader and a member of its left wing, was accused of being a fellow traveler by then-leader Hugh Gaitskell. Foot responded with a reference to Gaitskell and others of the party's right wing. "But who?" he asked. "Are they traveling with?" They, it turned out, had been traveling with the CIA for some years. Fellow passengers were Frenchmen, Germans, Dutch, Italians, and a host of other West Europeans, all taking part in a CIA operation to win the hearts and minds of liberals, social democrats, and assorted socialists, to keep them from the clutches of the Russian bear. It was an undertaking of major proportions. For some 20 years, the agency used dozens of American foundations, charitable trusts, and the like, including a few of its own creation, as conduits for payments to all manner of organizations in the United States and abroad, many of which, in turn, funded other groups. So numerous were the institutions involved, so many were the interconnections and overlaps, that it is unlikely that anyone at the CIA had a grasp of the full picture, let alone exercise broad control over it or proper accounting. See Appendix I for a partial organizational chart. The ultimate beneficiaries of this flow of cash were political parties, magazines, news agencies, journalists' unions, other unions and labor organizations, student and youth groups, lawyers' associations, and other enterprises already committed to the free world, which could be counted upon to spread the gospel further if provided with sufficient funding. The principal front organization set up by the CIA in this period was the grandly named Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF. In June 1950, prominent literati and scientists of the United States and Europe assembled in the Tiziana Palace Theater, in the American zone of Berlin, before a large audience to launch the organization whose purpose was to defend freedom and democracy against the new tyranny sweeping the world. The CCF was soon reaching out in all directions with seminars, conferences, and a wide program of political and cultural activities in Western Europe as well as India, Australia, Japan, Africa, and elsewhere. It had, moreover, more than 30 periodicals under its financial wing, including, in Europe, Socialist Commentary, Censorship, Science and Freedom, Minerva, Soviet Survey or Survey, China Quarterly, and Encounter in Great Britain, Proves, Censure contra les arts et la pensée, Mundo Nuevo, and Cuadernos in France, the last two in Spanish, aimed at Latin America, Perspective in Denmark, Argumenten in Sweden, Aerodalmi Ujsag in Hungary, Der Monat in Germany, Forum in Austria, Tempo Present in Italy, and Vision in Switzerland. There were as well CCF links to the New Leader, Africa Report, East Europe, and Atlas in New York. Generally, the CCF periodicals were well-written political and cultural magazines which, in the words of former CIA executive Ray Klein, would not have been able to survive financially without CIA funds. Amongst the other media-related organizations subsidized by the CIA in Europe at this time were the West German news agency DINA, later known as DPA, the International Association of Writers PN, located in Paris, certain French newspapers, the International Federation of Journalists, and Forum World Features, a news feature service in London whose stories were bought by some 140 newspapers around the world, including about 30 in the United States, amongst which were the Washington Post and, for other major dailies. The Church Committee of the U.S. Senate reported that major U.S. dailies, which took the service, were informed that Forum World Features was CIA-controlled. The Guardian and the Sunday Times of Great Britain also used the service, which earlier had been called Forum Service. By 1967, according to one of Forum's leading writers, the news service had become perhaps the principal CIA media effort in the world. No small accomplishment when one considers that the CIA, in its heyday, was devoting a reported 29% of its budget to media and propaganda. Another important recipient of CIA beneficence was Axel Springer, the West German press baron who was secretly funneled about $7 million in the early 1950s to help him build up his vast media empire. Springer, until he died in 1985, was the head of the largest publishing conglomerate in Western Europe, standing as a tower of pro-Western and anti-communist sentiment. The publisher of the influential West German weekly Der Spiegel, Rudolf Augstein, has observed, "No single man in Germany, before or after Hitler, with the possible exception of Bismarck or the two emperors, has had so much power as Springer." His relationship with the CIA reportedly continued until at least the early 1970s. The originator of the American program, the head of the CIA's International Organizations Division, Tom Braden, later wrote that the agency placed one operative in the CCF and that another became an editor of the CCF's most important magazine, Encounter. Presumably there was at least one CIA agent or officer in each of the funded groups. Braden stated that the agents could propose anti-communist programs to the official leaders of the organizations. He added, however, that it was a policy to protect the integrity of the organization by not requiring it to support every aspect of official American policy. The cultural freedom journals appealed to the non-Marxist left. Forum, by contrast, was conservative, generally eschewing the class struggle and excessive nationalization of industry. They subscribed to Daniel Bell's The End of Ideology thesis, the raison d'etre of which was that since no one could call for dying for capitalism with a straight face, the idea of dying for socialism or any other ideology had to be discredited. At the same time, the journals advocated a reformed capitalism, a capitalism with a human face. To the cold warriors in Washington who were paying the bills, however, the idea of reforming capitalism was of minimal interest. What was of consequence was the commitment of the magazines to a strong, well-armed, and united Western Europe, allied to the United States, which would stand as a bulwark against the Soviet bloc. Support for the common market and NATO. Critical analysis of what was seen as the intellectual component of international communist subversion. Skepticism of the disarmament pacifism, and neutralism espoused by the likes of the Prominent Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, in Great Britain. Criticism of U.S. foreign policy took place within the framework of Cold War assumptions. For example, that a particular American intervention was not the most effective way of combating communism. Not that there was anything wrong with intervention per se, or that the United States was supporting the wrong side. Private publications such as these could champion views which official U.S. government organs like the Voice of America could not, and still be credible. The same was true of the many other private organizations on the CIA payroll at this time. In 1960, CND and other elements of the Labor Party's left wing succeeded in winning over the party's conference to a policy of complete, unilateral nuclear disarmament and neutrality in the Cold War. In addition, 2 resolutions supporting NATO were voted down. Although the Labor Party was not in power at the time, the actions carried considerable propaganda and psychological value. Washington viewed the turn of events with not a little anxiety, for such sentiments could easily spread to the major parties of other NATO countries. The right wing of the Labor Party, which had close, not to say intimate, connections to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Encounter, New Leader, and other CIA assets and fronts, undertook a campaign to reverse the disarmament resolution. The committee set up for the purpose issued an appeal for funds, and soon could report that many small donations had been received, together with a large sum from a source that wished to remain anonymous. Over the next year, there was sufficient funding for a permanent office, a full-time, paid chairman and paid staff, field workers, traveling expenses, tons of literature sent to a large mailing list within the movement, a regular bulletin sent free, etc. Their opponents could not come close to matching this propaganda blitz. At the 1961 conference, the unilateralist and neutralist decisions were decisively overturned and the Labour Party returned to the NATO fold. Supporters of the CIA have invariably defended the agency's sundry activities in Western Europe on the grounds that the Russians were the first to be so engaged there and had to be countered. Whatever truth there may be in this assertion, the fact remains, as Tom Braden has noted, that the American effort spread to some fields where they, the Russians, had not even begun to operate. Braden doesn't specify which fields, but it seems that political parties was one. The CIA had working/financial relationships with leading members of the West German Social Democratic Party, two parties in Austria, the Christian Democrats of Italy, and the Liberal Party, in addition to the Labour Party in Britain, and probably at least one party in every other Western European country, all of which purported to be independent of either superpower, something the various communist parties, whether supported by the Soviet Union or not, could never get away with. The media provides another case in point. Neither Braden nor anyone else apparently has cited examples of publications or news agencies in Western Europe, pro-communist or anti-NATO, etc., which, ostensibly independent in the Cold War, were covertly funded by the Soviet Union. More importantly, it should be borne in mind that all the different types of enterprises and institutions supported by the CIA in Western Europe were supported by the agency all over the Third World for decades on a routine basis without a Russian counterpart in sight. The growing strength of the left in post-war Europe was motivation enough for the CIA to develop its covert programs, and this was a circumstance deriving from World War II and the economic facts of life, not from Soviet propaganda and manipulation. Operation Gladio. The rationale behind it was your standard Cold War paranoia. There's a good chance the Russians will launch an unprovoked invasion of Western Europe, and if they defeated the Western armies and forced them to flee, certain people had to remain behind to harass the Russians with guerrilla warfare and sabotage, and act as liaisons with those abroad. The stay-behinds would be provided with funds, weapons, communication equipment, and training exercises. The planning for this covert paramilitary network, codenamed Operation Gladio, Italian for Sword, began in 1949, involving initially the British, the Americans, and the Belgians. It eventually established units in every non-communist country in Europe, including Greece and Turkey and neutral Sweden and Switzerland, with the apparent exceptions of Ireland and Finland. The question of whether the units were more under the control of national governments or NATO remains purposely unclear, although from an operational point of view, it appears that the CIA and various other intelligence services were calling the shots. As matters turned out, in the complete absence of any Russian invasions, the operation was used almost exclusively to inflict political damage upon domestic leftist movements. The Gladio story broke in Italy in the fall of 1990, stemming from a judicial investigation into a 1972 car bombing, which discovered that the explosives had come from one of the 139 secret weapons depots kept for Gladio's forces in Italy. Subsequently, the head of the Italian parliamentary inquiry into the matter revealed that, when Gladio was started, the Americans would often insist that the organization also had to be used to counter any insurgencies. Retired Greek Gen. Nikos Kouris told a similar story, declaring that a Greek force was formed with CIA help in 1955 to intervene in case of communist threat, whether external or internal. There were ex-military men, specially trained soldiers, and also civilians. What held them together was one ideological common denominator: extreme rightism. As in Germany, see Germany chapter, the Italian operation was closely tied to terrorists. A former Gladio agent, Roberto Cavallero, went public to charge that there was a direct link between Gladio and Italy's wave of terrorist bombings in the 1970s and early 1980s, which left at least 300 dead. He said that Gladio had trained him and many others to prepare groups which, in the event of an advance by left-wing forces in our country, would fill the streets, creating a situation of such tension as to require military intervention. Cavallero was of course referring to electoral advances of the Italian Communist Party, not an invasion by the Soviet Union. The single worst terrorist action was the bombing at the Bologna railway station in August 1980, which claimed 86 lives. The Observer of London later reported, "The Italian railway bombings were blamed on the extreme left as part of a strategy to convince voters that the country was in a state of tension and that they had no alternative to voting the safe Christian Democrat ticket. All clues point to the fact that they were masterminded from within Gladio." One of the men sought for questioning in Italy about the Bologna bombing, Roberto Fiore, has lived in London ever since, and the British government has refused to extradite him. He is apparently under the protective wing of MI6, Britain's CIA, for whom he has provided valuable intelligence. The kidnapping and murder in 1978 of Aldo Moro, the leader of the Christian Democrats, which was attributed to the Red Brigades, appears now to have also been the work of Gladio agents provocateur who infiltrated the organization. Just prior to his abduction, Moro had announced his intention to enter into a governmental coalition with the Communist Party. In Belgium in 1983, to convince the public that a security crisis existed, Gladio operatives as well as police officers staged a series of seemingly random shootings in supermarkets which, whether intended or not, led to several deaths. A year later, a party of US Marines parachuted into Belgium with the intention of attacking a police station. One Belgian citizen was killed and one of the Marines lost an eye in the operation. That was intended to jolt the local Belgian police into a higher state of alert, and to give the impression to the comfortable population at large that the country was on the brink of Red Revolution. Guns used in the operation were later planted in a Brussels house used by a communist splinter group. As late as 1990, large stockpiles of weapons and explosives for Operation Gladio could still be found in some member countries, and Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti disclosed that more than 600 people still remained on the Gladio payroll in Italy. Continued on page 471. 16. British Guiana 1953 to 1964. The CIA's International Labor Mafia. For a period of 11 years, two of the oldest democracies in the world, Great Britain and the United States, went to great lengths to prevent a democratically elected leader from occupying his office. The man was Dr. Chetty Juggin. The grandson of indentured immigrants from India, Juggin had become a dentist in the United States, then returned to his native Guyana. In 1953, at the age of 35, he and the People's Progressive Party, PPP, were elected by a large majority to head the government of the British colony. Juggin's victory was due in part to the fact that Indians comprised about 46% of the population. Those of African origin made up about 36%. The PPP's program in office was hardly revolutionary. It encouraged foreign investment in the mining sectors while attempting to institute liberal reforms such as strengthening the rights of unionists and tenant farmers, creating a public school system that would lessen church control of education, and removing a ban on the import of undesirable publications, films, and records. But the British conservative government was not disposed to live with such policies advocated by a man who talked suspiciously like a socialist. The government and the British media, as well as the American media, subjected the Juggin administration to a campaign of Red Scare accusations and plain lies in the fashion of Senator McCarthy, whose ism was then all the rage in the United States. 4.5 months after Juggin took office, the government of Winston Churchill flung him out. The British sent naval and army forces, suspended the constitution, and removed the entire Guianese government. At the same time, the barristers drew up some papers which the Queen signed, so it was all nice and legal. Her Majesty's government, said the British colonial secretary during a debate in Parliament, are not prepared to tolerate the setting up of communist states in the British Commonwealth. The American attitude toward this slap in the face of democracy can be surmised by the refusal of the US government to allow Juggin to pass in transit through the United States when he tried to book a flight to London to attend the parliamentary debate. According to Juggin, Pan Am would not even sell him a ticket. Pan Am has a long history of collaboration with the CIA, a practice initiated by the airline's president, Juan Trippe, the son-in-law of Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Edward R. Stettintinius. By this time, the CIA had already gotten its foot in the door of the British Guiana labor movement by means of the marriage of the agency to the American Federation of Labor in the United States. One of the early offsprings of this union, was the Inter-American Regional Labor Organization, ORIT from the Spanish. In the early 1950s, ORIT was instrumental in the conversion of the leading confederation of unions in Guyana, the Trades Union Council, from a militant labor organization to a vehicle of anti-communism. Wrote Serafino Romualdi, at one time the head of AIFLD, see below, and a longtime CIA collaborator. Since my first visit to British Guiana in 1951, I did everything in my power to strengthen the democratic, i.e., anti-communist trade union forces opposed to him Juggin. This was to have serious repercussions for Juggin in later years. In 1957, running on a program similar to that of 4 years earlier, Juggin won the election again. Following this, the British deemed it wiser to employ more subtle methods for his removal, and the CIA was brought into the picture, one of the rare instances in which the agency has been officially allowed to operate in a British bailiwick. The CIA has done so unofficially on numerous occasions to the displeasure of British authorities. The CIA set to work to fortify those unions which already tended somewhat toward support of Juggin's leading political opponent, Forbes Burnham of the People's National Congress. One of the most important of these was the Civil Servants Union, dominated by blacks. Consequently, the CIA turned to Public Services International, PSI, in London, an international trade union secretariat for government employees, one of the international networks which exists to export the union know-how of advanced industrial countries to less developed countries. According to a study undertaken by the Sunday Times of London, by 1958 the PSI's finances were low, and its stocks were low with its own parent body, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, set up by the CIA in 1949 to rival the Soviet-influenced World Federation of Trade Unions. It needed a success of some kind. The financial crisis was resolved, quite suddenly, by the PSI's main American affiliate union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSM. AFSM's boss, Dr. Arnold Zander, told the PSI executive that he had been shopping and had found a donor. The spoils were modest at first, only a couple of £1,000s in 1958. It was the kind donor had said, for Latin America. The money went towards a PSI recruiting drive in the northern countries of Latin America by one William Doherty, Jr., a man with some previous acquaintance of the CIA. Doherty was later to become the executive director of the American Institute for Free Labor Development, the CIA's principal labor organization in Latin America. The donor was presumably pleased, because next year, 1959, Zander was able to tell the PSI that his union was opening a full-time Latin American section in the PSI's behalf. The PSI was charmed. The PSI's representative, said Zander, would be William Howard McCabe, a CIA labor apprentice. The Times continued, McCabe, a stocky, bullet-headed American, appeared to have no previous union history, but the PSI liked him. When he came to its meetings, he distributed cigarette lighters and photographs of himself doling out food parcels to the peasants. The lighters and the parcels were both inscribed with the compliments of the PSI. In 1967, in the wake of numerous revelations about CIA covert financing, the new head of AFSM admitted that the union had been heavily funded by the agency until 1964 through a foundation conduit, see Appendix I. It was revealed that AFSM's International Affairs Department, which had been responsible for the British Guiana operation, had actually been run by 2 CIA aides. CIA work within Third World unions typically involves a considerable educational effort, the basic premise of which is that all solutions will come to working people under a system of free enterprise, class cooperation, and collective bargaining, and by opposing communism in collaboration with management and government, unless, of course, the government, as in this case, is itself communist. The most promising students, those perhaps marked as future leaders, are singled out to be sent to CIA schools in the United States for further education. The CIA, said the Sunday Times, also appears to have had a good deal of success in encouraging politicians to break away from Juggin's party and government. Their technique of financing sympathetic figures was to take out heavy insurance policies for them. During the 1961 election campaign, the CIA's ongoing program was augmented by ad hoc operations from other American quarters. The U.S. Information Service took the most unusual step of showing its films, depicting the evils of Castroism and communism, on street corners of British Guiana. and the Christian anti-communist crusade brought its traveling road show down and spent a reported $76,000 on electoral propaganda which lived up to the organization's name. One historian has described this as a questionable activity for a private organization, which the State Department did nothing to discourage. On the other hand, the activities of US government agencies in British Guiana were no less questionable. Despite the orchestrated campaign directed against him, Juggin was re-elected by a comfortable majority of legislative seats, though with only a plurality of the popular vote. In October, at his request, Juggin was received at the White House in Washington. He had come to talk about assistance for his development program. President Kennedy and his advisors, however, were interested in determining where Juggin stood on the political spectrum before granting any aid. Oddly, the meeting, as described by Kennedy aide Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who was present, seemed to be conducted as if the Kennedy men were totally unaware of American destabilization activities in British Guiana. To Juggin's expressed esteem for the politics of British Labour leader Aneurin Bevan, those in the room all responded agreeably. To Juggin's professed socialism, Kennedy asserted that we are not engaged in a crusade to force private enterprise on parts of the world where it is not relevant. But when Juggin, perhaps naively, mentioned his admiration for the scholarly, leftist journal Monthly Review, it appears that he crossed an ideological line, which silently and effectively sealed his country's fate. Juggin, wrote Schlesinger later, was unquestionably some sort of Marxist. No economic aid was given to British Guiana while Juggin remained in power, and the Kennedy administration pressured the British to delay granting the country its independence, which had been scheduled to occur within the next year or two. Not until 1966, when Juggin no longer held office, did British Guiana become the independent nation of Guyana. In February 1962, the CIA helped to organize and finance anti-Juggin protests which used the newly announced budget as a pretext. The resulting strikes, riots, and arson were wholly out of proportion to the alleged instigation. A Commonwealth Commission of Inquiry later concluded, perhaps to the discomfort of the British Colonial Office which had appointed it, that there is very little doubt that, despite the loud protestations of the trades union leaders to the contrary, political affinities and aspirations played a large part in shaping their policy and formulating their program of offering resistance to the budget and making a determined effort to change the government in office. The CIA arranged, as it has on similar occasions, for North American and Latin American labor organizations, with which it had close ties, to support the strikers with messages of solidarity and food, thus enhancing the appearance of a genuine labor struggle. The agency also contrived for previously unheard of radio stations to go on the air and for newspapers to print false stories about approaching Cuban warships. The centerpiece of the CIA's program in British Guiana was the General Strike, so-called, although its support was considerably less than total, which began in April 1963. It lasted for 80 days, the longest general strike in history, it is said. This strike, as in 1962, was called by the Trades Union Council, TUC, which, as we have seen, was a member in good standing of the CIA's international labor mafia. The head of the TUC was one Richard Ishmael, who had been trained in the US at the CIA's American Institute for Free Labor Development along with other Guianese labor officials. The strike period was marked by repeated acts of violence and provocation, including attacks on Juggin's wife and some of his ministers. No action was taken against Ishmael and others in this group by British authorities who missed no opportunity to exacerbate the explosive situation, hoping that it would culminate in Juggin's downfall. Meanwhile, CIA agents were giving advice to local union leaders on how to organize and sustain the strike, the New York Times subsequently reported. They also provided funds and food supplies to keep the strikers going and medical supplies for pro-Burnham workers injured in the turmoil. At one point, one of the agents even served as a member of a bargaining committee from a Guyana Dyke Workers Union that was negotiating with Dr. Juggin. This agent was later denounced by Juggin and forbidden to enter the country. This is probably a reference to Gene Meekins, one of the CIA's main labor operatives, who had been serving as public relations advisor and education officer to the TUC. Meekins edited a weekly paper and broadcast a daily radio program by means of which he was able to generate a great deal of anti-Juggin propaganda. The Sunday Times study concluded that Juggin seems to have thought that the unions could hold out a month. But McCabe was providing the bulk of the strike pay, plus money for distress funds, for the strikers' daily 15 minutes on the radio and their propaganda, and considerable traveling expenses. All over the world, it seemed brother unions were clubbing together. The mediator sent from London, Robert Willis, the General Secretary of the London Typographical Society, and a man not noted for his mercy in bargaining with newspaper managements, was shocked. "It was rapidly clear to me that the strike was wholly political," he said. Juggin was giving in to everything the strikers wanted, but as soon as he did, they erected more demands. Financial support for the strike alone, channeled through the PSI and other labor organizations by the CIA, reached the sum of at least $1 million. American oil companies provided a further example of the multitude of resources the U.S. can bring to bear upon a given target. The companies cooperated with the strikers by refusing to provide petroleum, forcing Juggin to appeal to Cuba for oil. During Juggin's remaining year in office, in the face of a general U.S. economic embargo, he turned increasingly to the Soviet bloc. This practice, of course, provided ammunition to those critics of Juggin in British Guiana, the United States and Great Britain, who insisted that he was a communist and thus fraught with all the dangers that communists are fraught with. The strike was maintained primarily by black supporters of Forbes Burnham and by employers who locked out many of Juggin's Indian supporters. This inevitably exacerbated the already existing racial tensions, although the Sunday Times asserted that the racial split was fairly amicable until the 1963 strike divided the country. Eventually, the tension broke out into bloodshed, leaving hundreds dead and wounded, and a legacy of racial bitterness. Juggin was certainly aware, to some extent at least, of what was transpiring around him during the general strike. After it was over, he charged that the United States, in spite of protestations to the contrary by some of its leaders, is not prepared to permit a socialist government or a government committed to drastic and basic reforms to exist in this hemisphere. Even when this government has been freely elected, it is all too clear that the United States will only support a democratic government if it favors a classic private enterprise system. In an attempt to surmount the hurdle of U.S. obsession with the Soviet Union and another Cuba in the Western Hemisphere, Juggin proposed that British Guiana be neutralized by an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, as the two powers had done in the case of Austria. Officials in Washington had no comment on the suggestion. Chetty Juggin's government managed to survive all the provocations and humiliations. With elections on the agenda for 1964, the British and their American cousins turned once again to the gentlemanly way of the pen. The British Colonial Secretary, Duncan Sandys, who had been a leading party to the British CIA agreement concerning Juggin, cited the strike and general unrest as proof that Juggin could not run the country or offer the stability that the British government required for British Guiana to be granted its independence. Sandys was the founder, in 1948, of the European Movement, a CIA-funded Cold War organization. This was, of course, a contrived position. Syndicated American columnist Drew Pearson, writing about the meeting between President Kennedy and British Prime Minister Macmillan in the summer of 1963, stated that the main thing they agreed on was that the British would refuse to grant independence to Guyana because of a general strike against pro-communist Prime Minister Chetty Juggin. That strike was secretly inspired by a combination of U.S. Central Intelligence money and British intelligence. It gave London the excuse it wanted. The excuse was used further to justify an amendment to the British Guiana Constitution providing for a system of proportional representation in the election, a system that appeared certain to convert Juggin's majority of legislative seats into a plurality. Subsequently, the British-appointed governor of British Guiana announced that he would not be bound to call on the leader of the largest party to form a government if it did not have a majority of seats, a procedure in striking contrast to that followed in Great Britain. When, in October 1964, the Labour Party succeeded the Conservative Party to power in Great Britain, Juggin had hopes that the conspiracy directed against him would be squashed, for several high-ranking Labour leaders had stated publicly, and to Juggin personally, their opposition to the underhanded and anti-democratic policy of their Conservative Party foes. Within days of taking office, however, the Labour Party dashed these hopes. Bowing to United States wishes, the New York Times disclosed, the Labour Party ruled out early independence for British Guiana and was going ahead with the proportional representation elections. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, it was reported, had left the new British Foreign Secretary, Patrick Gordon Walker, in no doubt that the United States would resist a rise of British Guiana as an independent Castro-type state. On a previous occasion, Rusk had urged Gordon Walker's conservative predecessor, Lord Home, to suspend the British Guiana Constitution again and revert to direct colonial government. The intensive American lobbying effort against British Guiana, the actual campaign of subversion aside, led Conservative MP and former Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod to observe in the House of Commons. There is an irony which we all recognize in the fact of America urging us all over the world towards colonial freedom, except when it approaches her own doorstep. The day before the election of December 7th, a letter appeared in a British Guiana newspaper, a bogus pro-communist letter, a tactic the CIA has used successfully the world over. The letter was purportedly written by Juggin's wife Janet to Communist Party members, in which she stated, "We can take comfort in the thought that the PNC Burnham's party will not be able to stay in power long. Our communist comrades abroad will continue to help us win eventual total victory." Ms. Juggin quickly retorted that she would not be so stupid as to write a letter like that. But as in all such cases, the disclaimer trailed weakly and too late behind the accusation. As expected, Juggin won only a plurality of the legislative seats, 24 of 53. The governor then called upon Forbes Burnham, who had come in second, to form a new government. Burnham had also been named as a terrorist in the British police report referred to earlier, as had several of his new government ministers. Juggin refused to resign. British Army troops were put on full alert in the capital city of Georgetown. A week later, Her Majesty's government waved its hand over a piece of paper, thereby enacting another amendment to the British Guiana Constitution and closing a loophole which was allowing Juggin to stall for time. He finally surrendered to the inevitable. In 1990, at a conference in New York City, Arthur Schlesinger publicly apologized to Chetty Juggin, who was also present. Schlesinger said that it was his recommendation to the British that led to the proportional representation tactic. "I felt badly about my role 30 years ago," the former Kennedy aide admitted. "I think a great injustice was done to Chetty Juggin." 4 years later, with Juggin again president, having won, in 1992, the country's first free election since he had been ousted, the Clinton administration prepared to nominate a new ambassador to Guyana, William Doherty, Jr. Juggin was flabbergasted and made his feelings known, such that Doherty was dropped from consideration. When it was time, in 1994, for the U.S. government to declassify its British Guiana documents under the 30-year rule, the State Department and CIA refused to do so, reported the New York Times, because it is not worth the embarrassment. The newspaper added, "Still classified documents depict in unusual detail a direct order from the president to unseat Dr. Juggin," say government officials familiar with the secret papers. Though many presidents have ordered the CIA to undermine foreign leaders, they say the Juggin papers are a smoking gun, a clear written record, without veiled words or plausible denials, of a president's command to depose a prime minister. "They made a mistake putting Burnham in," said Janet Juggin, looking back at it all. "The regrettable part is that the country went backwards, and so it had. One of the better-off countries in the region 30 years ago, Guyana in 1994 was among the poorest. Its principal export was people." 17. Soviet Union late 1940s to 1960s. From spy planes to book publishing. Information hundreds of young Americans and emigre Russians gave their lives so that the United States could amass as much information as possible about the Soviet Union. Almost any information at all about the land Churchill had described as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. There is no evidence, however, that any of the information collected ever saved any lives or served any other useful purpose for the world. Today, tons of files stuffed with reports, volumes of computer printouts, tapes, photographs, etc., lie in filing cabinets, gathering dust in warehouses in the United States and West Germany. Probably a good part of the material has already been shredded. Much of it has never been looked at and never will be. Beginning in the late 1940s, the US military, the CIA, and the National Security Agency regularly sent aircraft along the borders of the Soviet Union to collect visual, photographic, and electronic data of a military or industrial nature, particularly to do with Soviet missile and nuclear capability. The increasingly sophisticated planes and equipment, as well as satellites, submarines, and electronic listening posts in Turkey and Iran, produced vast amounts of computer input. At times, the planes would unintentionally drift over Soviet territory. At other times, they would do so intentionally in order to photograph a particular target, or to activate radar installations so as to capture their signals, or to evaluate the reaction of Soviet ground defenses against an attack. It was a dangerous game of aerial chicken, and on many occasions the planes were met by anti-aircraft fire or Soviet fighter planes. In both 1950 and 1951, an espionage airplane with a crew of 10 was shot down, with no survivors. In 1969, a crew of 31 was lost, this time to North Korean fighters over the Sea of Japan. During the intervening years, there were dozens of air incidents involving American aircraft and communist firepower, arising from hundreds, if not thousands, of espionage flights. Some of the spy planes made it safely back to base, which might be Turkey, Iran, Greece, Pakistan, Japan, or Norway, after being attacked and even hit. Others were downed with loss of life or with crew members captured by the Soviets. There has been considerable confusion concerning the number and the fate of U.S. airmen captured by the Soviets after their planes made forced landings or were shot down during the 1950s and 60s. Russian President Boris Yeltsin stated in 1992 that 9 U.S. planes had been shot down in the early 1950s and 12 American survivors had been held prisoner, their ultimate fate not yet discovered. 5 months later, Dmitry Volkogonov, former Soviet general and co-chairman of a Russian-U.S. commission investigating the whole question of missing Americans, told a U.S. Senate committee that 730 airmen had been captured on Cold War spy flights, their fate likewise unclear. The most notable of these incidents was, of course, the downing of the U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers on May 1, 1960. The ultra-high-flying U-2 had been developed because of the vulnerability to being shot down of planes flying at normal altitudes. The disappearance of Powers and his U-2 somewhere in the Soviet Union ensnared the United States government publicly in an entanglement of a false cover story, denials, and amendments to denials. Finally, when the Russians presented Powers and his plane to the world, President Eisenhower had no alternative but to admit the truth. He pointedly added, however, that flights such as the U-2s were distasteful but vital, given the Russian fetish of secrecy and concealment. One of Eisenhower's advisors, Emmett John Hughes, was later to observe that it thus took the administration only 6 days to transform an unthinkable falsehood into a sovereign right. On several occasions, the United States protested to the Soviet Union about Soviet attacks on American planes which were not actually over Soviet territory, but over the Sea of Japan, for example. Though engaged in espionage, such flights, strictly speaking, appear to be acceptable under international law. The most serious repercussion of the whole U-2 affair was that it doomed to failure the Eisenhower-Khrushchev summit meeting, which took place 2 weeks later in Paris, and upon which so much hope for peace and détente had been placed by people all over the world. Was the U-2 affair the unfortunate accident of timing that history has made it out to be? Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, U.S. Air Force, Ret. has suggested otherwise. From 1955 to 1963, Prouty served as the liaison between the CIA and the Pentagon on matters concerning military support of special operations. In his book, The Secret Team, Prouty suggests that the CIA and certain of the agency's colleagues in the Pentagon sabotaged this particular U-2 flight, the last one scheduled before the summit. They did this, presumably, because they did not relish a lessening of Cold War tensions, their raison d'etre. The method employed, Prouty surmises, was remarkably simple. The U-2's engine needed infusions of liquid hydrogen to maintain the plane's incredible altitude, which placed it outside the range of Soviet firepower and interceptor aircraft. If the hydrogen container were only partly filled upon takeoff from Turkey, it would be simply a matter of time, calculable to coincide with the plane being over Soviet territory, before the U-2 was forced to descend to a lower altitude. At this point, whether the plane was shot down or Powers bailed out, allowing it to crash is not certain. The Soviet Union claimed that it had shot down the U-2 at its normal high altitude with a rocket, but this was probably a falsehood born of 4 years of frustrating failure to shoot a single U-2 from the sky. In any event, the Russians were able to present to the world a partially intact spy plane along with a fully intact spy pilot, complete with all manner of incriminating papers on him, and an unused suicide needle. The presence of identification papers was no oversight, says Prouty. Deliberately, neither pilot nor plane were sanitized on this flight as was required on other flights. Powers, in his book, doesn't discuss the liquid hydrogen at all. He believed his plane was disabled and forced to descend by the shock waves of a Soviet near miss. But he recounts technical problems with the plane even before the presumed near miss. In light of the furor raised by the shooting down of a South Korean commercial airliner by the Soviet Union in 1983, which the Russians claimed was spying, it is interesting to note that Prouty also makes mention of the United States at one time using a seemingly clean national commercial airline of an unspecified foreign country to do some camera spying or other clandestine project. To the Russians, the spy planes were more than simply a violation of their airspace, and they rejected the notion put forth by the US that the flights were just another form of espionage. Intelligence collection activities are practiced by all countries, said Washington. At the time, there had been no indication of Soviet flights over the United States. The Russians viewed the flights as particularly provocative because airplanes are a means of conducting warfare. They can be considered as the beginning of hostilities, and may even be carrying bombs. The Russians could not forget that the Nazis had preceded their invasion of the Soviet Union with frequent reconnaissance overflights. Neither could they forget that in April 1958, US planes carrying nuclear bombs had flown over the Arctic in the direction of the USSR due to a false warning signal on American radar. The planes were called back when only 2 hours flying time separated them from the Soviet Union. No American plane dropped bombs on the Soviet Union, but many of them dropped men assigned to carry out hostile missions. The men who fell from the sky were Russians who had emigrated to the West, where they were recruited by the CIA and other Western intelligence organizations. The leading emigre organization was known as National Alliance of Russian Solidarists, or the National Union of Labor, NTS. It was composed largely of two distinct groups: the sons of the Russians who had gone to the West following the revolution, and those Russians who, through circumstance or choice, had wound up in Western Europe at the close of the Second World War. Members of both groups had collaborated with the Nazis during the war. Although NTS was generally classified in the right wing of the various emigre organizations, their collaboration had been motivated more by anti-Stalinism than by pro-Nazi sentiments. NTS was based primarily in West Germany, where, throughout the 1950s, the CIA was the organization's chief benefactor, often its sole support. At a CIA school set up in Germany under the imposing name of the Institute for the Study of the USSR, as well as at schools in Great Britain and the United States, the agency provided NTS members with extensive training before airdropping them into Soviet territory. The men landed on their native soil elaborately equipped, with everything from weapons to collapsible bicycles, frogman suits, and rubber mats for crossing electrically charged barbed wire fences. The Russians were returned to their homeland for a variety of reasons: to gather intelligence about military and technological installations, commit assassinations, obtain current samples of identification documents, assist Western agents to escape, engage in sabotage, for which they were well trained, methods of derailing trains and wrecking bridges, actions against arms factories and power plants, etc., or instigate armed political struggle against communist rule by linking up with resistance movements, a wholly unrealistic goal given the feeble state of such movements, but one which some NTS fanatics swore by. It will never be known just how many men the CIA infiltrated into the Soviet Union, not only by air but by border crossings and by boat as well. Many hundreds at least. As to their fate, the Soviet Union published a book in 1961 called Caught in the Act = CIA, in which were listed the names and other details of about 24 infiltrators the Russians claimed to have captured, often almost immediately upon arrival. Some were executed, others received prison sentences. One allegedly was an individual who had taken part in a mass execution of Jews in German-occupied Soviet territory. The book asserts that there were many more caught who were not listed. This may have been a self-serving statement, but it was a relatively simple matter for the Russians to infiltrate the émigrés' ranks in Western Europe and learn the entire operation. The CIA, to be sure, was not naive about this practice. The agency went so far as to torture suspected defectors in Munich, using such esoteric methods as applying turpentine to a man's testicles, or sealing someone in a room and playing Indonesian music at deafening levels until he cracked. The Russians further claimed that some of those smuggled in were furnished with special radio beacons to guide planes where to land other agents, and which could also be used to direct US bombers in the event of war. Some of the émigrés made it back to Western Europe with their bits and pieces of information, or after attempting to carry out some other assignment. Others, provided with a complete set of necessary documents, were instructed to integrate themselves back into Soviet society and become agents in place. Still others, caught up in the emotions of being home, turned themselves in once again the human factor which no amount of training or indoctrination can necessarily circumvent. No American operation against the Soviet Union would be complete without its propaganda side, bringing the gospel to the heathen in a myriad of ways that displayed the creativity of the CIA and its team of émigrés. Novel mechanisms were developed to enable airplanes and balloons to drop anti-communist literature over the Soviet Union. When the wind was right, countless leaflets and pamphlets were scattered across the land, or quantities of literature were floated downstream in waterproof packages. Soviet citizens coming to the West were met at every turn by NTS people, handing out their newspapers and magazines in Russian and Ukrainian. To facilitate contact, NTS at times engaged in black market operations and opened small shops which catered to Russians at cheap prices. From North Africa to Scandinavia, the CIA network confronted Soviet seamen, tourists, officials, athletes, even Soviet soldiers in East Germany, to present them with the truth as seen by the free world, as well as to pry information from them, to induce them to defect or to recruit them as spies. Hotel rooms were searched, phones tapped, bribes offered, or blackmail threatened in attempts to reach these ends. Actions were also undertaken to entrap or provoke Soviet diplomatic personnel, so as to cause their expulsion and or embarrass the Soviet Union. The propaganda offensive led the US government into the book publishing business. Under a variety of arrangements with American and foreign publishers, distributors, literary agents, and authors, the CIA and the United States Information Agency, USIA, produced, subsidized, or sponsored well over 1,000 books by 1967 which were deemed to serve a propaganda need. Many of the books were sold in the United States as well as abroad. None bore any indication of US government involvement. Of some, said the USIA, "We control the things from the very idea down to the final edited manuscript." Some books were published, and at times written only after the USIA or the CIA agreed to purchase a large number of copies. There is no way of determining what effect this financial incentive had upon a publisher or author concerning a book's tone and direction. In some cases, Washington released classified information to an author to assist him or her in writing the book. In 1967, following revelations about CIA domestic activities, this practice purportedly came to an end in the US, although it continued abroad. A Senate committee in 1976 stated that during the preceding few years, the CIA had been connected with the publication of some 250 books, mostly in foreign languages. Some of these were most likely later reprinted in the United States. The actual identity of most of the books, however, is still classified. Among those which have been revealed are The Dynamics of Soviet Society by Walt Rostow, The New Class by Milo Vangelos, Concise History of the Communist Party by Robert A. Burton, The Foreign Aid Programs of the Soviet Bloc in Communist China by Kurt Muller, In Pursuit of World Order by Richard N. Gardner, Peking and People's Wars by Major General Sam Griffith, The Yan'an Way by Eudocia Ravines, Life and Death in Soviet Russia by Valentin Gonzalez, The Anthill by Suzanne Labin, The Politics of Struggle, The Communist Front and Political Warfare by James D. Atkinson, From Colonialism to Communism by Hong Vin Chi, Why Vietnam, by Frank Traeger, and Terror in Vietnam by Jay Malin. In addition, the CIA financed and distributed throughout the world the animated cartoon film of George Orwell's Animal Farm. The most pervasive propaganda penetration of the socialist bloc was by means of the airwaves. Numerous transmitters, tremendous wattage, and often round-the-clock programming brought Radio Liberty and Radio Free Russia to the Soviet Union, Radio Free Europe and radio in the American sector to Eastern Europe, and the Voice of America to all parts of the world. With the exception of the last, the stations were ostensibly private organizations financed by gifts from American corporations, nickel and dime donations from the American public, and other private sources. In actuality, the CIA covertly funded almost all of the costs until 1971. Exposure of the agency's role in 1967, although it had been widely assumed long before then, led to Congress eventually instituting open governmental financing of the stations. The stations served the purpose of filling in some of the gaps and correcting the falsehoods of the communist media, but could not escape presenting a picture of the world, both East and West, shot through with their own omissions and distortions. Their mission in life was to emphasize whatever could make the communist regimes look bad. To many in the CIA, wrote Victor Marchetti, former senior official of the agency, the primary value of the radios was to sow discontent in Eastern Europe and, in the process, to weaken the communist governments. Many of the Russians who worked for the various stations, which broadcast at length about freedom, democracy, and other humanitarian concerns, were later identified by the US Justice Department as members of Hitler's notorious Einsatzgruppen, which rounded up and killed numerous Jews in the Soviet Union. One of these worthies was Stanislaw Stankiewicz, under whose command a mass murder of Jews in Belarusia was carried out, in which babies were buried alive with the dead, presumably to save ammunition. Stankiewicz wound up working for Radio Liberty. German war criminals as well were employed by the CIA in a variety of anti-Soviet operations. By every account, the sundry programs to collect strategic information about the Soviet Union, particularly via infiltration into the country and encountering Soviet nationals in the West, were a singular flop. The information reported was usually trivial, spotty, garbled, or out of date. Worse, it was often embellished, if not out-and-out fabricated. Many post-war émigrés in Western Europe made their living in the information business. It was their most saleable commodity. From a real or fictitious meeting with a Soviet citizen, they would prepare a report which was often just ordinary facts with a bit of political color added on. At times, as many as 4 versions of the report would be produced, differing in style and quantity of facts. Written by 4 different people, the reports would then be sold separately to US, British, French, and West German intelligence agencies. The CIA's version contained everything in the other 3 versions, which were eventually transmitted to the agency by the other countries without their source being revealed. Analysis of all the reports tended to bring the CIA to the conclusion that the NTS was giving them the fullest picture of all, and that the information all tallied. NTS looked good, and the files grew thick. The CIA's Russian files in Washington, meanwhile, approached mountainous proportions with the data acquired from opening mail between the Soviet Union and the United States, a practice begun in the early 1950s and continued at least into the 1970s. Said a Post Office Council in 1979, "If there was no national security mail cover program, the FBI might be inhibited in finding out if a nation was planning war against us." Former CIA officer Harry Rositsk, who was closely involved with anti-Soviet operations after the war, later wrote that the primary task of the émigrés infiltrated into the Soviet Union during the early years, and the same could probably be said of the spy planes, was to provide early warning of a Soviet military offensive against the West, an invasion which, in the minds of cold warriors in the American government, appeared perpetually imminent. This apprehension was reminiscent of the alarms sounded following the Russian Revolution, see introduction to the original edition, and similarly flourished despite the fact of a Russia recently devastated by a major war and hardly in a position to undertake a military operation of any such magnitude. Nevertheless, wrote Rositsk, it was officially estimated that Soviet forces were capable of reaching the English Channel in a matter of weeks. It was an axiom in Washington that Stalin was plotting war. When would it come? He pointed out, however, that the mere existence of radio-equipped agents on Soviet terrain with no early warnings to report had some cautionary value in tempering the war scare among the military estimators at the height of the Cold War. A secret report of the National Security Resources Board of January 1951 warned, "As things are now going, by 1953 if not 1952, the Soviet aggressors will assume complete control of the world situation." Rositsk, although a committed anti-communist, recognized the unreality of such thinking. But, as he explained, his was a minority opinion in official Washington. The facts available even at the time suggested the far greater likelihood that Moscow's post-war strategy, including the conversion of Eastern Europe into a Western buffer, was basically defensive. It is nonetheless a simple fact that no scenario was written then, nor has it been written since, to explain why the Russians would want to conquer Western Europe by force or to bomb the United States. Neither action would have contributed in any tangible way to the Soviet national interest and would have hazarded the destruction of the Soviet state. This basic question was never raised, for the Cold War prism created in the minds of the diplomatic and military strategists a clear-cut world of black and white. There were no grays. Several years were to pass, Rositsk pointed out, before it became clear to Washington that there were no warnings, early or otherwise, to report. This, however, had no noticeable effect upon the United States military buildup or Cold War propaganda. 18. Italy 1950s to 1970s. Supporting the cardinals, orphans, and techno-fascism. After the multifarious extravaganza staged by the United States in 1948 to exorcise the specter of communism that was haunting Italy, the CIA settled in place for the long haul with a less flamboyant but more insidious operation. A White House memorandum, prepared after the 1953 election, reported that neither the Moscow war stick nor the American economic carrot was being visibly brandished over the voters in this election. Covert funding was the name of the game. Victor Marchetti, former executive assistant to the deputy director of the CIA, has revealed that in the 1950s the agency spent some $20 to $30 million a year, or maybe more, to finance its programs in Italy. Expenditures in the 1960s, he added, came to about $10 million annually. The CIA itself has admitted that between 1948 and 1968, it paid a total of $65,150,000 to the Christian Democrats and other parties, to labor groups, and to a wide variety of other organizations in Italy. It also spent an undisclosed amount in support of magazines and book publishers and other means of news and opinion manipulation, such as planting news items in non-American media around the world which cast unfavorable light upon communism, then arranging for these stories to be reprinted in friendly Italian publications. It is not known when, if ever, the CIA ended its practice of funding anti-communist groups in Italy. Internal agency documents of 1,972 reveal contributions of some $10 million to political parties, affiliated organizations, and 21 individual candidates in the parliamentary elections of that year. At least $6 million was passed to political leaders for the June 1976 elections. And in the 1980s, CIA Director William Casey arranged for Saudi Arabia to pay $2 million to prevent the communists from achieving electoral gains in Italy. Moreover, the largest oil company in the United States, Exxon Corporation, admitted that between 1963 and 1972 it had made political contributions to the Christian Democrats and several other Italian political parties totaling $46 million to $49 million. Mobil Oil Corporation also contributed to the Italian electoral process to the tune of an average $500,000 a year from 1970 through 1973. There is no report that these corporate payments derived from persuasion by the CIA or the State Department, but it seems rather unlikely that the firms would engage so extravagantly in this unusual sideline with complete spontaneity. Much of the money given by the CIA to Italian political parties since World War II, said a former high-level U.S. official, ended up in villas, in vacation homes, and in Swiss bank accounts for the politicians themselves. A more direct American intervention into the 1976 elections was in the form of propaganda. Inasmuch as political advertising is not allowed on Italian television, the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, Nathaniel Davis, arranged for the purchase of large blocks of time on Monte Carlo TV to present a daily news commentary by the editorial staff of the Milan newspaper Il Giornale Nuovo, which was closely associated with the CIA. It was this newspaper that, in May 1981, set in motion that particular piece of international disinformation known as the KGB plot to kill the Pope. Another Italian newspaper, the Daily American of Rome, for decades the country's leading English-language paper, was for a long period in the 1950s to the 70s partly owned and or managed by the CIA. We had at least one newspaper in every foreign capital at any given time. The CIA admitted in 1977, referring to papers owned outright or heavily subsidized, or infiltrated sufficiently to have stories printed which were useful to the agency or suppress those it found detrimental. Ambassador Davis also arranged for news items which had been placed in various newspapers by the agency to be read on Monte Carlo TV and Swiss TV, both of which were received in Italy. The programs were produced in Milan by Franklin J. Tonini of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, and Michael Ledeen, a reporter with Il Giornale Nuovo. Ledeen, an American, was later a consultant to the Reagan administration and a senior fellow at the conservative think tank of Georgetown University in Washington, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The relentless fight against the Italian Communist Party took some novel twists. One, in the 1950s, was the brainchild of American Ambassador Claire Booth Luce. The celebrated Ms. Luce, playwright and wife of Time magazine publisher Henry Luce, decided to make it known that no U.S. Department of Defense procurement contracts would be awarded to Italian firms whose employees had voted to be represented by the communist-controlled labor union. In the case of Fiat, this had dramatic results. The communist union's share of the vote promptly fell from 60 to 38%. Then there was the case of Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini, another beneficiary of CIA largesse. The payments made to him reveal something of the agency's mechanistic thinking about why people become radicals. It seems that the good cardinal was promoting orphanages in Italy during the 1950s and 1960s, and, says Victor Marchetti, the thinking was that if such institutions were adequately supported, many young people would be able to live well there and so would not one day fall into communist hands. The cardinal, as a Monsignor, had been involved with the Vatican's operation to smuggle Nazis to freedom after World War II. He had a long history of association with Western governments and their intelligence agencies. In 1963, he became Pope Paul VI. In a 1974 interview, Marchetti also spoke of the training provided by the agency to the Italian security services. They are trained, for example, to confront disorders and student demonstrations, to prepare dossiers, to make the best possible use of bank data and tax returns of individual citizens, etc. In other words, to watch over the population of their country with the means offered by technology. This is what I call techno-fascism. William Colby, later director of the CIA, arrived in Italy in 1953 as station chief and devoted the next 5 years of his life to financing and advising center-slash-right organizations for the express purpose of inducing the Italian people to turn away from the leftist bloc, particularly the Communist Party, and keep it from taking power in the 1958 elections. In his account of that period, he justifies this program on the grounds of supporting democracy or center democracy and preventing Italy from becoming a Soviet satellite. Colby perceived all virtue and truth to be bunched closely around the center of the political spectrum, and the Italian Communist Party to be an extremist organization committed to abolishing democracy and creating a society modeled after the worst excesses of Stalinist Russia. He offers no evidence to support his conclusion about the communists, presumably because he regards it as self-evident, as much to the reader as to himself. Neither, for that matter, does he explain what was this thing called democracy, which he so cherishes and which the communists were so eager to do away with. Colby comes across as a technocrat who carried out the orders of his side and mouthed the party line without serious examination. When Oriana Falassi, the Italian journalist, interviewed him in 1976, she remarked at the close of a frustrating conversation, "Had you been born on the other side of the barricade, you would have been a perfect Stalinist." To which Colby replied, "I reject that statement, but, well, it might be. No, it might not." American policymakers dealing with Italy in the decades subsequent to Colby's time there did not suffer any less than he from hardening of the categories. Colby, after all, took pains to point out his liberal leanings. These were men unable to view the Italian Communist Party in its indigenous political context, but only as a national security threat to the United States and NATO. Yet, all those years, the party was proceeding along a path revisionist enough to make Lenin turn in his grave if he were in one. The path was marked by billboards proclaiming the democratic advance to socialism and the national road to socialism, the abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the denunciation of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The party pushed its national role as responsible opposition, participated in the drive for productivity, affirmed its support for a multi-party system and for Italy remaining in the common market and in NATO, and was second to none in its condemnation of any form of terrorism. On many occasions, it was the principal political force in city governments including Rome, Florence, and Venice, without any noticeable return to barbarism, and was a de facto participant in the running of the Italian state. The Socialist Party, a prime target of the United States in the 1948 elections, was a formal member of the government for much of the 1960s to the 1990s. In the files of the State Department and the CIA lie any number of internal reports prepared by anonymous analysts testifying to the reality of the Communist Party's historic compromise and the evolution of its estrangement from the Soviet Union known as Eurocommunism. In the face of this, however, in the face of everything, American policy remained rooted in place, fixed in a time that was no longer and probably never was. A policy that had nothing to do with democracy by whatever definition. and everything to do with the conviction that a communist government in Italy would not have been the supremely pliant Cold War partner that successive Christian Democrat regimes were for decades. It would not have been enough for such a government to be independent of Moscow. The problem with a communist government was that it would probably have tried to adopt the same position towards Washington.
19 Việt Nam 1950 1973.
The Hearts and Minds Circus. Contrary to repeated statements by Washington officials during the 1960s that the United States did not intervene in Vietnam until, and only because, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, the U.S. was deeply and continually involved in that woeful land from the year 1950 onwards. The initial fateful step was the decision to make large-scale shipments of military equipment, tanks, transport planes, etc., to the French in Vietnam in the spring and summer of 1950. In April, Secretary of State Dean Acheson had told French officials that the United States government was set against France negotiating with their northern-based Vietnamese foes, the Viet Minh, also spelled Viet Minh or Viet Minh. The name was short for League for the Independence of Vietnam, a broadly based nationalist movement led by communists. Washington was not particularly sympathetic to France's endeavor to regain control of its colony of 100 years and had vacillated on the issue, but the rise to power of the communists in China the previous autumn had tipped the scale in favor of supporting the French. To the Truman administration, the prospect of another communist government in Asia was intolerable. There was a secondary consideration as well at the time: the need to persuade a reluctant France to support American plans to include Germany in West European defense organizations. During World War II, the Japanese had displaced the French. Upon the defeat of Japan, the Viet Minh took power in the north, while the British occupied the south, but soon turned it back to the French. Said French General Jean Leclerc in September 1945, "I didn't come back to Indochina to give Indochina back to the Indochinese." Subsequently, the French emphasized that they were fighting for the free world against communism, a claim made in no small part to persuade the United States to increase its aid to them. American bombers, military advisors, and technicians by the hundreds were to follow the first aid shipments, and over the next few years direct American military aid to the French war effort ran to about $1 billion a year. By 1954, the authorized aid had reached the sum of $1.4 billion and constituted 78% of the French budget for the war. The extensive written history of the American role in Indochina produced by the Defense Department, later to be known as the Pentagon Papers, concluded that the decision to provide aid to France directly involved the United States in Vietnam and set the course for future American policy. There had been another path open. In 1945 and 1946, Viet Minh leader Ho Chi Minh had written at least 8 letters to President Truman and the State Department asking for America's help in winning Vietnamese independence from the French. He wrote that world peace was being endangered by French efforts to reconquer Indochina, and he requested that the 4 powers, US, USSR, China, and Great Britain, intervene in order to mediate a fair settlement and bring the Indochinese issue before the United Nations. This was a remarkable repeat of history. In 1919, following the First World War, Ho Chi Minh had appealed to U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing for America's help in achieving basic civil liberties and an improvement in the living conditions for the colonial subjects of French Indochina. This plea, too, was ignored. Despite the fact that Ho Chi Minh and his followers had worked closely with the American OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, during the recently ended World War, while the French authorities in Indochina had collaborated with the Japanese, the United States failed to answer any of the letters, did not reveal that it had received them, and eventually sided with the French. In 1950, part of the publicly stated rationale for the American position was that Ho Chi Minh was not really a genuine nationalist, but rather a tool of international communism, a conclusion that could be reached only by deliberately ignoring the totality of his life's work. He and the Viet Minh had, in fact, been longtime admirers of the United States. Ho trusted the U.S. more than he did the Soviet Union and reportedly had a picture of George Washington and a copy of the American Declaration of Independence on his desk. According to a former OSS officer, Ho sought his advice on framing the Viet Minh's own Declaration of Independence. The actual Declaration of 1945 begins with the familiar "all men are created equal." They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it was the French who were to receive America's blessing. Ho Chi Minh was, after all, some kind of communist. The United States viewed the French struggle in Vietnam and their own concurrent intervention in Korea as two links in the chain aimed at containing China. Washington was adamantly opposed to the French negotiating an end to the war which would leave the Viet Minh in power in the northern part of the country, and, at the same time, free the Chinese to concentrate exclusively on their Korean border. In 1952, the U.S. exerted strong pressure upon France not to pursue peace feelers extended by the Viet Minh, and a French delegation, scheduled to meet with Viet Minh negotiators in Burma, was hastily recalled to Paris. Bernard Fall, the renowned French scholar on Indochina, believed that the cancelled negotiations could perhaps have brought about a ceasefire on a far more acceptable basis for the French than the one obtained 2 years later in the shadow of crushing military defeat. Subsequently, to keep the French from negotiating with the Viet Minh, the United States used the threat of a cessation of their substantial economic and military aid. This prompted a French newspaper to comment that the Indochina War has become France's #1 earning export. In November 1953, the omnipresent CIA airline, CAT, helped the French Air Force airlift 16,000 men into a fortified base the French had established in a valley in the north called Dien Bien Phu. When the garrison was later surrounded and cut off by the Viet Minh CAT pilots, flying U.S. Air Force C-119s, often through anti-aircraft fire, delivered supplies to the beleaguered French forces in this their Waterloo. By 1954, the New York Times could report that the French Air Force is now almost entirely equipped with American planes. The United States had also constructed a number of airfields, ports, and highways in Indochina to facilitate the war effort, some of which American forces were to make use of in their later wars in that area. In April 1954, when a French military defeat was apparent and negotiations at Geneva were scheduled, the National Security Council urged President Eisenhower to inform Paris that French acquiescence in a communist takeover of Indochina would bear on its status as one of the Big Three, and that U.S. aid to France would automatically cease. A council paper recommended that it be U.S. policy to accept nothing short of a military victory in Indochina, and that the U.S. actively oppose any negotiated settlements in Indochina at Geneva. The council stated further that, if necessary, the U.S. should consider continuing the war without French participation. The Eisenhower administration had for some time very seriously considered committing American combat troops to Vietnam. Apparently, this move was not made only because of uncertainty about congressional approval and the refusal of other countries to send even a token force, as they had done in Korea, to remove the appearance of a purely American operation. We are confronted by an unfortunate fact, lamented Secretary of State John Foster Dulles at a 1954 cabinet meeting. Most of the countries of the world do not share our view that communist control of any government anywhere is in itself a danger and a threat. In May, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, sent a memorandum to Defense Secretary Charles Wilson on studies with respect to possible U.S. actions regarding Indochina, which stated that the employment of atomic weapons is contemplated in the event that such course appears militarily advantageous. General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's Director of Intelligence, put it a bit more poetically when he advocated the use of atomic bombs to create a belt of scorched earth across the avenues of communism to block the Asiatic hordes. By this time, 2 American aircraft carriers equipped with atomic weapons had been ordered into the Gulf of Tonkin, in the north of Vietnam, and Dulles is, in fact, reported to have offered his French counterpart, Georges Bidault, atomic bombs to save Dien Bien Phu. Bidault was obliged to point out to Dulles that the use of atomic bombs in a war of such close armed conflict would destroy the French troops as well as the Viet Minh. Dulles regularly denounced China, in the ultra-sanctimonious manner he was known for assisting the Viet Minh, as if the Chinese had no cause or right to be alarmed about an anti-communist military crusade taking place scant miles from their border. As the Geneva Conference approached, a CIA propaganda team in Singapore began to disseminate fabricated news items to advance the idea that the Chinese were giving full armed support to the Viet Minh and to identify the Viet Minh with the world communist movement. The CIA believed that such stories would strengthen the non-communist side at the Geneva talks. Joseph Burkholder Smith was a CIA officer in Singapore. His press asset was Wan Li Huan Lee, an experienced local journalist. It is instructive to note the method employed in the creation and dissemination of one such news report about the Chinese. After Smith and Lee had made up their story, Lee attended the regular press conference held by the British High Commissioner in Singapore, Malcolm MacDonald. At the conference, Lee mentioned the report and asked the commissioner if he had any comment. As expected, MacDonald had nothing to say about it one way or the other. The result was the following news item. More Chinese supplies and troops spotted en route to Haiphong. At the press conference of the British High Commissioner for Southeast Asia today, reports of the sightings of Chinese naval vessels and supply ships in the Tonkin Gulf en route from Hainan to Haiphong were again mentioned. According to these reports, the most recent of many similar sightings occurred 1 week ago when a convoy of 10 ships were spotted. Among them were 2 armed Chinese naval vessels, indicating that the convoy consisted of troops as well as arms and supplies. High Commissioner Malcolm MacDonald would not elaborate further about these reports. The story was put onto a wire service in the morning, and by the evening had gone around the world, coming back to Singapore on the European relay to Asia. The Geneva Conference, on July 20th, 1954, put a formal end to the war in Vietnam. The United States was alone in refusing to sign the final declaration, purely because it was peeved at the negotiated settlement, which precluded any further military effort to defeat the Viet Minh. There had been ample indication of American displeasure with the whole process well before the end of the conference. 2 weeks earlier, for example, President Eisenhower had declared at a news conference, "I will not be a party to any treaty that makes anybody a slave. Now that is all there is to it." But the U.S. did issue a unilateral declaration in which it agreed to refrain from the threat or the use of force to disturb the accords. The letter and the spirit of the ceasefire agreement and the final declaration looked forward to a Vietnam free from any military presence other than Vietnamese or French, and free from any aggressive operations. However, while the conference was still in session in June, the United States began assembling a paramilitary team inside Vietnam. By August, only days after the close of the conference, the team was in place. Under the direction of CIA leading light Edward Lansdale, fresh from his success in the Philippines, a campaign of military and psychological warfare was carried out against the Viet Minh. Lansdale's activities in Vietnam were later enshrined in 2 semi-fictional works, The Ugly American and The Quiet American. Over the next 6 months, Lansdale's clandestine team executed such operations as the following. He encouraged the migration of Vietnamese from the north to the south through an extremely intensive, well-coordinated, and, in terms of its objective, very successful psychological warfare operation. Propaganda slogans and leaflets appealed to the devout Catholics with such themes as "Christ has gone to the south" and "The Virgin Mary has departed from the north." It distributed other bogus leaflets, supposedly put out by the Viet Minh, to instill trepidation in the minds of people in the north about how life would be under communist rule. The following day, refugee registration to move south tripled. The exodus of Vietnamese to the south during the regrouping period that followed the Geneva Accords was often cited by American officials in the 1960s, as well as earlier, as proof of the fact that the people did not want to live under communism. "They voted with their feet" was the catchphrase. Still other Viet Minh leaflets were aimed at discouraging people in the south from returning to the north. Infiltrated paramilitary forces into the north under the guise of individuals choosing to live there. Contaminated the oil supply of the bus company in Hanoi so as to lead to a gradual wreckage of the bus engines. It took the first actions for delayed sabotage of the railroad, which required teamwork with the CIA Special Technical Team in Japan, who performed their part brilliantly. Instigated a rumor campaign to stir up hatred of the Chinese with the usual stories of rapes. Created and distributed an almanac of astrological predictions carefully designed to play on Vietnamese fears and superstitions and undermine life in the north while making the future of the south appear more attractive. Published and circulated anti-communist articles and news reports in newspapers and leaflets, attempted, unsuccessfully, to destroy the largest printing establishment in the north because it intended to remain in Hanoi and do business with the Viet Minh. Laid some of the foundation for the future American war in Vietnam by sending selected Vietnamese to U.S. Pacific bases for guerrilla training, training the armed forces of the South who had fought with the French, creating various military support facilities in the Philippines, smuggling into Vietnam large quantities of arms and military equipment to be stored in hidden locations, developing plans for the pacification of Viet Minh and dissident areas. At the same time, the United States began an economic boycott against the North Vietnamese and threatened to blacklist French firms which were doing business with them. Another development during this period that had very profound consequences for the coming tragedy was the cancellation of the elections that would have united North and South Vietnam as one nation. The Geneva Accords specified that elections under international supervision were to be held in July 1956, with consultations to prepare for them to be held from July 20th, 1955 onwards. The United States, in its unilateral declaration, had reiterated this pledge. In the case of nations now divided against their will, we shall continue to seek to achieve unity through free elections supervised by the United Nations to ensure that they are conducted fairly. The elections were never held. On July 16, 1955, 4 days before the consultations were scheduled to begin, President Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam issued a statement that made it clear that he had no intention of engaging in the consultations, much less the elections. 3 days later, North Vietnam sent Diem a formal note calling for the talks, but Diem remained firm in his position. Efforts by France and Great Britain to persuade Diem to begin the talks were to no avail. The reason for Diem's intransigence is well known. He, like President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, knew that Ho Chi Minh would be a certain winner of any national elections. A CIA national intelligence estimate in the autumn concluded that the Diem regime, which Lansdale himself called fascistic, almost certainly would not be able to defeat the communists in countrywide elections. Later, Eisenhower was to write in his memoirs, "I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader rather than Chief of State Bao Dai." The latter was Diem's predecessor. The study of the Pentagon Papers cited State Department cables and National Security Council memorandums indicating that the Eisenhower administration wished to postpone the elections as long as possible and communicated its feelings to Mr. Diem. This was support that Diem could not have done without, for, as the Pentagon historians point out, without the threat of U.S. intervention, South Vietnam could not have refused to even discuss the elections called for in 1956 under the Geneva Settlement without being immediately overrun by the Viet Minh armies. The public statements of Diem and Dulles spoke only of their concern that the elections would not be free, which served to obscure the fact that Ho Chi Minh did not need to resort to fraud in order to win, as well as ignoring the announcements of both the United Nations and the International Control Commission, set up in Vietnam by the Geneva Accords, that they were ready to supervise the elections. In any event, Diem's commitment to free elections may be surmised from a referendum he held in October 1955 in South Vietnam to invest his regime with a semblance of legality, in which he received 98.2% of the vote. Life magazine later reported that Diem's American advisors had told him that a 60% margin would be quite sufficient and would look better, but Diem insisted on 98%. With the elections canceled, the nation still divided, and Diem with his mandate free to continue his heavy, tyrannical rule, the turn to violence in South Vietnam became inevitable. As if in knowledge of and preparation for this, the United States sent 350 additional military men to Saigon in May 1956, an example of the U.S. ignoring the Geneva Accords, stated the Pentagon study. Shortly afterwards, Dulles confided to a colleague, "We have a clean base there now without a taint of colonialism. Dien Bien Phu was a blessing in disguise." The later phase, "If you grab him by the balls, the hearts and minds will follow. Give us your hearts and minds or we'll burn down your goddamn village." The end result of America's anti-communist policy in Vietnam. Also its beginning and its middle. There was little serious effort to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, even less chance of success, for the price of success was social change, of the kind that Diem was unwilling to accept in Vietnam, the kind the United States was not willing to accept anywhere in the Third World. If Washington had been willing to accept such change, which they have always routinely and disparagingly dismissed as socialist, there would have been no need to cancel the elections or to support Diem, no need for intervention in the first place. There was consequently no way the United States could avoid being seen by the people of Vietnam as other than the newest imperialist occupiers, following in the footsteps of first the Chinese, then the French, then the Japanese, then the French again. To the men who walked the corridors of power in Washington, to the military men in the field, Indochina, nay, Southeast Asia was a single large battlefield. Troops of South Vietnam were used in Laos and Cambodia. Troops of Thailand were used in Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam. Thailand and the Philippines were used as bases from which to bomb the three countries of Indochina. Military officers in South Vietnam, Thailand, and Taiwan were trained at American schools in the Philippines. CIA-supported forces carried out incursions and invasions into China from Laos, Burma, and Taiwan. When there was a much-publicized pause in the bombing of North Vietnam, more American planes were thus available to increase the bombing of Laos. And so it went. From 1955 to 1959, Michigan State University, under a U.S. government contract, conducted a covert police training program for the South Vietnamese. With the full knowledge of certain MSU officials, 5 CIA operatives were concealed in the staff of the program and carried on the university's payroll as its employees. By the terms of a 1957 law, drawn up by the MSU group, every Vietnamese 15 years and older was required to register with the government and carry ID cards. Anyone caught without the proper identification was considered as a National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, suspect and subject to imprisonment or worse. At the time of registration, a full set of fingerprints was obtained and information about the person's political beliefs was recorded. When popular resistance to No Din Diem reached the level where he was more of a liability than an asset, he was sacrificed. On November 1st, 1963, some of Diem's generals overthrew him and then murdered both him and his brother after they had surrendered. The coup, wrote Time magazine, was planned with the knowledge of Dean Rusk and Avril Harriman at the State Department, Robert S. McNamara and Roswell Gilpatrick at the Defense Department, and the late Edward R. Murrow at the U.S. Information Agency. Evidently, Washington had not planned on assassinations accompanying the coup, but as General Maxwell Taylor, President Kennedy's principal military advisor, has observed, the execution of a coup is not like organizing a tea party. It's a very dangerous business. So I didn't think we had any right to be surprised. When Diem and his brother were murdered, Donald Duncan was a member of the Green Berets in Vietnam. He has written about his training, part of which was called Countermeasures to Hostile Interrogation, ostensibly how Americans captured by communists could deal with being tortured. Translations of an alleged Soviet interrogation manual were handed out to the class. The manual described in detail such methods as the airplane ride, hanging by the thumbs, the cold hot water treatment, and the lowering of a man's testicles into a jeweler's vice, while the instructor, a Sergeant Lacey, explained some variations of these methods. Then a student had a question. Sergeant Lacey, the name of this class is Countermeasures to Hostile Interrogation, but you have spent most of the period telling us there are no countermeasures. If this is true, then the only reason for teaching them the torture methods, it seems to me, is so that we'll know how to use them. Are you suggesting we use these methods? The class laughs, and Lacey looks down at the floor, creating a dramatic pause. When he raises his head, his face is solemn, but his deep-set eyes are dancing. We can't tell you that, Sergeant Harrison. The mothers of America wouldn't approve. The class bursts into laughter at the sarcastic cynicism. Furthermore, a conspiratorial wink. We will deny that any such thing is taught or intended. At the U.S. Navy schools in San Diego and Maine during the 1960s and 1970s, the course had a different name. There, the students were supposedly learning about methods of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape which they could use as prisoners of war. There was in the course something of survival in a desert, where students were forced to eat lizards, but the naval officers and cadets were also subjected to beatings, jarring judo flips, tiger cages, hooded and placed in a 16 cubic foot box for 22 hours with a coffee can for their excrement, and a torture device called the water board. The subject strapped to an inclined board, head downward, a towel placed over his face, and cold water poured over the towel. He would choke, gag, retch, and gurgle as he experienced the sensation of drowning, just as was done to Viet Cong prisoners in Vietnam, along with the tiger cages. A former student, Navy pilot LT, Wendell Richard Young, claimed that his back was broken during the course and that students were tortured into spitting, urinating and defecating on the American flag, masturbating before guards, and, on one occasion, engaging in sex with an instructor. Fabrications were required to support the varied State Department claims about the nature of the war and the reasons for the American military actions. A former CIA officer, Philip Leichty, stated in 1982 that in the early 1960s he saw written plans to take large amounts of communist bloc arms, load them on a Vietnamese boat, fake a battle in which the boat would be sunk in shallow water, then call in Western reporters to see the captured weapons as proof of outside aid to the Viet Cong. This is precisely what occurred in 1965. The State Department's white paper, Aggression from the North, which came out at the end of February 1965, relates that a suspicious vessel was sunk in shallow water off the coast of South Vietnam on February 16, 1965, after an attack by South Vietnamese forces. The boat was reported to contain at least 100 tons of military supplies, almost all of communist origin, largely from communist China and Czechoslovakia, as well as North Vietnam. The white paper noted that representatives of the Free Press visited the sunken North Vietnamese ship and viewed its cargo. Leichty said that he had also seen documents involving an elaborate operation to print large numbers of postage stamps showing a Vietnamese shooting down a U.S. Army helicopter. The former CIA officer stated that this was a highly professional job, and that the very professionalism required to produce the multicolor stamps was meant to indicate that they were produced by the North Vietnamese because the Viet Cong would not have had the capabilities. Leichty claimed that letters in Vietnamese were then written and mailed all over the world with the stamp on them, and the CIA made sure journalists would get hold of them. Life magazine, in its issue of February 26, 1965, did in fact feature a full-color blow-up of the stamp on its cover, referring to it as a North Vietnam stamp. This was just 2 days before the State Department's white paper appeared. In reporting Leichty's statements, the Washington Post noted, publication of the white paper turned out to be a key event in documenting the support of North Vietnam and other communist countries in the fighting in the South and in preparing American public opinion for what was to follow very soon, the large-scale commitment of U.S. forces to the fighting. Perhaps the most significant fabrication was that of the alleged attack in August 1964 on 2 U.S. destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf off the coast of North Vietnam. President Johnson used the incident to induce a resolution from Congress to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed forces to prevent further North Vietnamese aggression. It was a blanket endorsement for escalation heaped upon escalation. Serious enough doubts were raised at the time about the reality of the attack, but over the years other information has come to light which has left the official story in tatters. And probably the silliest fabrication, the 1966 U.S. Army training film, County Fair, in which the sinister Viet Cong are shown in a jungle clearing heating gasoline and soap bars, concocting a vicious communist invention called napalm. The Johnson administration's method of minimizing public concern about escalation of the war, as seen by a psychiatrist. First step, highly alarming rumors about escalation are leaked. Second step, the president officially and dramatically sets the anxieties to rest by announcing a much more moderate rate of escalation, and accompanies this announcement with assurances of the government's peaceful intentions. Third step, after the general sigh of relief, the originally rumored escalation is gradually put into effect. The succession of leaks, denials of leaks, and denials of denials thoroughly confuses the individual. He is left bewildered, helpless, apathetic. The end result is that the people find themselves deeply committed to large-scale war without being able to tell how it came about, when and how it all began. Senator Stephen Young of Ohio was reported to have said that while he was in Vietnam, he was told by the CIA that the agency disguised people as Viet Cong to commit atrocities, including murder and rape, so as to discredit the communists. After the report caused a flurry in Washington, Young said that he had been misquoted, that the CIA was not the source of the story. Congressman Cornelius Gallagher, who had accompanied Young on the trip, suggested that it may well be that Young spoke to a Viet Cong disguised as a CIA man. From a speech by Carl Oglesby, President of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, during the March on Washington, November 27, 1965, the original commitment in Vietnam was made by President Truman, a mainstream liberal. It was seconded by President Eisenhower, a moderate liberal. It was intensified by the late President Kennedy, a flaming liberal. Think of the men who now engineer that war, those who study the maps, give the commands, push the buttons, and tally the dead. Bundy, McNamara, Rusk, Lodge, Goldberg, the President Johnson himself. They are not moral monsters. They are all honorable men. They are all liberals. The international communist conspiracy in action. During the heat of the fighting in 1966 to 67, the Soviet Union sold to the United States over $2 million worth of magnesium, a metal vital in military aircraft production, when there was a shortage of it in the United States. This occurred at a time when Washington maintained an embargo on supplying communist nations with certain alloys of the same metal. At about the 1,000 tons of steel to the United States and South Vietnam for use in the construction of new air and army bases when no one else could meet the American military's urgent need. This, while Washington maintained a boycott on Chinese products.
Basically, the point of what was just playing, communists just want everybody to have housing, food, healthcare, and education. The United States government wants to charge people for that stuff. And in the process, a lot of people die. There's a joke that you should just die from a preventable disease like a responsible American because you can't afford the cure, which people in other countries get for free because their government has socialized the healthcare. United States military-industrial complex and prison-industrial complexes want to profit from locking people in cages. The U.S. government will go to any lengths to prevent people from having free housing, healthcare, and education. Even if that means murdering countless civilians. more and more Americans are becoming anarchists, socialists, and communists because we're tired of working 12 hours a day and still not being able to save money or raise a family. 7 days a week. And that's called wage slavery. So if you're tired of being a wage slave, look up the Freedom Road Socialist Organization or the Revolutionary Communists of America. We have friends everywhere.